Okay, so I'm about to start burning. I'm gonna go ahead and put my mask on. This clips around like this. Just like that. If the tip loosens while you're burning, just gently tighten them using your pliers. The metal really softens when they're hot, so it makes them more susceptible to damage. So just remember to be gentle when you're using your pliers to tighten the tips. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. You can see I've done a little bit here. So what I like to do with the straight edge is go in and kind of do all of the parts where I'm using this motion. It makes it a lot easier so I'm not constantly turning my tool. And I get a little bit more of a consistent overall look. And as you're burning, I'm going to fill this in later with a texture. So if you make these little sort of marks on the inside of there, that's okay. Sometimes you have to kind of twist and turn your burner to fit. I just like to make sure I'm not making those marks on the outer edges. So again, I'm just using my straight edge to kind of get these straight vertical spots here. And then once all of these vertical lines are done, I'll show you how I like to do these curved angles on the letters. This can be a little bit more tricky. And remember what I said earlier, you don't need to push down really hard. The heat is doing all of the work for you. You just need to push down hard enough so that you've got a controlled grip on this burner. You don't need to push down so hard that it breaks. And you can see here where I sort of made a mistake with my carbon. So I'm just making sure that I'm covering that up with my burn and I'm leaving that mark on the inside there, because remember, we're going to fill that in later. I can go ahead and do this big C. Just like to go slow and guide my burner across the wood. You can see the straight edge tip is really cutting through those grains, so you're not getting these horribly bumpy edges. Okay, I'm going to turn this so I can get the other vertical lines this way. Sometimes when you're burning, it's easier to shift the canvas around so that you're more comfortable in a position than it is to try to twist your hand all around. Now I'm going to show you how to hit some of these harder to reach areas. What I like to do is take the very tip of my straight edge tip here and sort of flip it up and use the very tip to get these curves. Because the metal edge of the straight edge tip is longer than the angles of these curves, it's a little bit harder to use the whole edge. You tend to overburn in spots you don't want to. So I like to flip it upside down and use the very point here. It's not as easy to get those nice crisp lines as it is with the larger point, but you can always come back and clean it up with that fine point tip like I was telling you earlier. If there's a spot that's too bumpy, you can just clean it up. Okay, so now we're done with the outline. And you can fill this in a bunch of different ways. You can get the flat shader tip and just do like a solid burn on the inside, or you can use one of those rounded tips like I was telling you about earlier and do like a dot pattern or maybe like a line texture or all kinds of stuff. So let's do that now. I'm going to switch my tips and then we're going to fill all this lettering in. So I'm going to turn my burner off, let it cool all the way down, put my new tip in, and then let it warm back up. So now we're ready to start filling in. We finished the outline and I let my burner cool off, switched my tip, I put my flat shader tip in. I'm just going to do a solid fill in with this burn. I'm not going to do any texture or anything like that, just going to fill it in. So I've let this heat back up. Now I am ready to start filling in. So you can see this flat shader tip has this big, nice flat side on it. So all you need to do is just put that flat side inside of your letters here and just fill it in. It's a little too wide for this C, so I'm not using the whole space. I'm kind of turning it on the edge a little bit so that I don't overburn on the outside. And it's helpful to go a little bit slower. Sometimes if you go too fast, you can accidentally go outside of these lines here and overburn on the outside of your lines. You also want to make sure as you're burning you don't angle too far because this wand piece here is really hot too. So if this edge here touches the wood in a spot you don't want burnt, it will burn it. So you kind of make sure you don't turn it too far. these are even more narrow, so you want to make sure you're kind of turning your flat shader tip on its side just ever so slightly so you don't overburn outside of those lines. You can use the tip here to get in these smaller spots. And you can see now we're covering up some of these little spots here where we were turning and curving before. So I'm just going to continue to burn my letters here until I get them completely filled in. Okay, now we have finished filling in. It's all filled in. So I want to show you real quick what I was talking about earlier, but there's a couple little carbon marks here in my O, and I've got my sand eraser. Let's see if we can get rid of those. Sometimes the heat from the burner will sort of meld this to the wood and it will come off. And if that's the case, you can always burn over it. Just burn a bit of a thicker line. But these are coming off pretty well. So you can use sandpaper for this. You can use this sand eraser. Like I said, the sand eraser is just a little bit easier to use because you can kind of get into these smaller spots like this. And there you go. We've erased that mark. There's another one. All gone. So, one other option is you can, or addition really to this one, so you can use that fine point that I was telling you about earlier, this point, and you can kind of clean up some of these. There's a couple of spots here that are a little rough. You can kind of use that fine point to clean that up, or you can use the point on your straight edge. It has a little tip on the edge here. You can use this. It's not quite as easy to use as the fine point tip, but it's already loaded on my burner and hot, so I'm going to try to make do here. And so I'm just going to kind of clean up a couple of these little bumpy spots. Okay, so now it looks just a little bit smoother. Okay, now we have finished filling in. It's all filled in. So I want to show you real quick what I was talking about earlier, but there's a couple little carbon marks here in my O, and I've got my sand eraser. Let's see if we can get rid of those. Sometimes the heat from the burner will sort of meld this to the wood and it will come off. And if that's the case, you can always burn over it. Just burn a bit of a thicker line. But these are coming off pretty well. So you can use sandpaper for this. You can use this sand eraser. Like I said, the sand eraser is just a little bit easier to use because you can kind of get into these smaller spots like this. And there you go. We've erased that mark. There's another one. So now it looks just a little bit smoother. Okay, all done. Now we just need to varnish. Okay, so now let's move on to the next project, and we're going to get into some more advanced shading techniques. Now, this is still pretty basic, but it's an intro into shading, and I think it'll be a good example of how to sort of step those shades up. I've got a template here. We're going to do some deep burns on these birds and some deep burns in the mountains, and then we're going to get lighter and lighter and lighter in our shades as the mountains go back. So again, the first thing I'm going to do is tape this down to my wood and get this transferred. My piece of wood is a little bit bigger than my template, but that's okay. They're just real simple mountain shapes. I can kind of freehand these edges a little bit. So I'm going to tape it. I've got my carbon. I'm going to add my carbon underneath, and I've got my little pencil here. My burner is on. It's heating up. And so we're going to go ahead and start tracing this out while we're getting the burner warmed up. So I'm just tracing along as carefully as I can here. There's more room for error on an art piece like this than there is with lettering like the previous piece. Lettering is much more precise, but you've got some room for error here. So if you get out of the lines a little bit, it's okay. So what I'm going to do is go over the outline for each one of these birds. And I've got a second burner over here heating up. And I've got my little small round tip in it. I'm going to add a little bit of a texture instead of a flat burn to these birds. I wanted you to be able to see that dot and stipple pattern. It's a nice way to add some more visual appeal to a piece than just a flat, solid burn. Instead of filling in these birds with a flat burn, I'm going to add a dot pattern texture, or a stipple as it's sometimes referred to. I like to add texture to silhouettes because it gives the piece more visual appeal than just a solid flat burn. Okay, we got that filled in. Now, let's start working on these mountains. Not going to outline these, just going to start burning. So I'm going to start, you see in the template here, the one closest to us is the darkest, and it's going to get lighter as we go back. Kind of gives us a little bit of a sense of depth in the piece. So I'm going to start with the darkest one. I've got my fan here. I like to use my little fan because the Chandler tool doesn't have heat settings. So once we get into these lighter shades, I'll need my fan blowing on the tip just a little bit to cool it enough so that it doesn't burn too deep or too dark once I initially touch the wood. So for right now, I'm going to start with these darker ones in the front and just let my burner go across the wood like this. So I'm just filling in the mountains with a flat burn here, but in a horizontal motion. This horizontal motion is going to give it the lightest bit of texture, and it's going to kind of make the mountains look ripple-ish. It's a nice subtle effect. These larger areas just take a while to burn, especially when you're burning really deep like this. A nice dark color on the burn, it just takes a long time. Okay. Let's move on to the next section. We want it to be a little bit lighter. Not too. Not going to turn on my fan yet because I can achieve a little bit of a lighter color just by moving faster along the wood. So when we get into these super light sections, that we're going to have to turn that fan on. So the longer you leave your burner in one place, the more color you're going to get. So it's going to be darker the slower you go. So if you want to achieve a lighter color, you need to just move a little bit faster. And we don't want it to be too much lighter. Just enough that we can see a difference in these two mountains. So I'm just leaving my flat shader tip on the wood here, and I'm using this circular motion, a constant circular motion to keep the tip moving. If I let it sit on the wood too long, it's going to burn too deep. I need to keep it moving. And if I want to go lighter, I just go a little bit faster. I need this to be a little bit on the dark side, so I'm going back over it and over and over it until I get the shade that I want. It's better to start out with a lighter shade and just continuing to go over it again and again and again until you get the depth that you want than it is to try to get a deep burn in one motion. It's much harder that way. I'm going to come back over here. So I'm using my circular motion here again to fill in this whole area. The circular motion gives me more control and helps me achieve a consistent color. This circular motion also gives me a lot of control over the color. I tried to just do one motion across the surface and it's either going to be too light or too dark and you're going to have to go over it again and again. I like this circular motion because I can continue to get a consistent color across one large area like this. Maybe it's not quite dark enough. want to see these lines. You can see my carbon marks in here. So I'm going to use the tip, kind of turn it up a little bit just so the tip's hitting the wood. And I'm going to kind of go back over just that bit. Try to cover these carbon marks up a little bit. Okay. Now down. Okay. I'm continuing the same technique as I've been using. I'm using that circular motion to shade. The only difference is that I want a lighter shade, so I'm moving my tip a little bit faster so that the wood doesn't burn as deep. You know, one of the things you can do to practice this before you sit down with an actual project is to get some scrap pieces of wood and just practice this circular motion. You can draw out a couple of boxes, start with a really light shade, then move on to another shade and another shade, and you can kind of do a little practice run at shading. You can usually get some scrap wood at like some of the big box stores, some of the big box hardware stores. Just give yourself a little practice session before you start out with a project. You can kind of still see my carbon marks in there a little bit, so I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I'm going to go over this edge. I've turned up the tip just a little bit, so just the front edge is touching. And I'm just going to kind of go over these carbon marks a little bit so you can't see them as well. See some white spots in here too. I'm trying to fix those. edge here, you can kind of cover those up. It just looks like a little bit of a shadow on the top of this mountain here. Okay. Now, I'm going to get my sand eraser back out and erase these. These have really got to be lightened up because the shades are going to get even lighter. I'm going to start with my white eraser, see if I can get a little bit of that off first with this. So now we're going to cover this section here. It's going to be pretty light, so I'm going to switch my fan on. I'm going to hold my burner in front of the fan just for a second. And get it cool enough to touch the wood. Okay. You can still see it's still pretty, it's got a significant amount of heat in it still. So you can see we've got our gradients of shade and mountains. We're all done. All we need to do is varnish.